Well, the right time is now. The right time is as soon as possible. I'm with Zelensky on this. Look what Ukraine is doing. Ukraine is defending Europe. It's defending Europe's values. And Ukraine is defending NATO's values and standing up to aggression to a country that's trying to change its borders by force. That's what NATO is all about. It's a defensive alliance. So the sooner we can get Ukraine into NATO, the better. We have not North Macedonia is a member of NATO. Albania is a member of NATO. Montenegro has just joined NATO. Really, we need to get Ukraine in as quickly as possible. And I'm disappointed if that is going to be the final communique. But I guess when Zelensky gets there, he'll tell them straight.
You accept then the argument from Ukraine that to be inside NATO would act as a deterrent to Russia to continue their actions?
Oh yes, it's absolutely clear to me that Putin would not have done this if Ukraine had been inside NATO right from the start. And don't forget, we all signed a treaty to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, Ukraine's borders, over 30 years ago. Unless you stand up to Putin and make it clear then that you are going to defend these countries, then of course he's going to nibble away. And when he says it's a provocation, he said that when Finland joined. He's saying that now about Sweden joined. He probably said that when the Warsaw Pact countries crossed over and decided to join the defensive alliance. So I don't take that argument seriously.
But the difference is Finland didn't have Russian troops in it. Sweden, when it becomes a member, it's been agreed, did not have Russian troops in it at that time. The situation is totally different with Ukraine. You would have to, by accepting Ukraine into NATO, send NATO troops into the country to fight with Russians.
Well, you'd have to get the timing absolutely right, yes. Obviously, it would be easier to set a timescale by which Russian troops must withdraw, as they will have to withdraw in the end, because Ukraine will keep on fighting until they do withdraw. But at that point, yes, absolutely, Ukraine should join. And that's why I think the timetable that should have been offered to Zelensky, and I hope still will be offered tonight to President Zelensky, I hope the timetable will be much clearer.
And there's no way you think that Ukraine's security could be better guaranteed by NATO countries in a way that stops short of full NATO backing?
Well, they haven't done that so far. Look,
No.
if NATO had offered the kind of air support that was required right at the beginning that President Zelensky asked for, if NATO had supplied the missiles and shells he'd asked for, then they wouldn't have to fight in the trenches, this kind of almost First World War battle against the Russians. If NATO had been there right at the beginning, and there's plenty more, by the way, that NATO can be doing in stepping up the supply of shells and missiles.
Cluster munitions?
Ukraine is being outshelled at the moment. Russia is using cluster munitions against civilians. They're bombing clinics, they're bombing nurseries, they're bombing private flats. Now, so long as, if you're going to use cluster munitions, and there are no nice weapons. There are no weapons that, don't kill. That's what weapons are for. They're there to defend your territory. But Ukraine, the difference is, of course, Ukraine would use them in the military way, whereas Russia is just spraying them around and killing completely innocent civilians, contrary to the laws of war.
Well, Russia would say that is the military way, to use them to hit various buildings. But Ukraine would use them in what way?
That is against the laws of war. Russia is not respecting the Geneva Conventions. We've seen that with its treatment of prisoners. We've seen that with torture. We've seen that with the rapes that have been reported. Russia is not respecting the laws. And therefore it's wrong, I think, to say that Ukraine, should be somehow held back. At the moment, it's facing a bigger enemy in Russia.
Do you think Zelensky then has a right to be pretty furious about how NATO has dealt with his country, given the original invitation to join was back in 2008, and the West, and you were Defence Secretary at the time, of course, rather turned its back on Ukraine when Russia invaded in 2014?
Yes, I've been at 3 of these NATO summits, and the Ukrainians have been there every time. They've been there, asking for a membership plan, a proper timetable, and begging for more defensive weapons because they saw this coming. And it did come in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea and when they started the insurrection down in the southeast, the Donbass region of Ukraine.
But NATO blinked as well then.
NATO blinked as well then. And all the NATO members did. President Obama, and the rest, and the other Europeans, and France and Germany, and I'm sad to say ourselves, decided not to sell him the weapons that were needed. In fact, that's why I started the training program. That's all we could do. We started training the Ukrainian army back in 2015, and some of that training, I hope, has paid off today.
Your German counterpart, when you were Defence Secretary, you mentioned Germany there, was one Ursula von der Leyen. Biden is apparently pushing her to be the next NATO General Secretary. I wonder what you made of her when you came in contact with her when you were Defence Secretary.
Well, she's a very experienced defence minister, and I'm nothing against Ursula von der Leyen. But we have a very experienced candidate here in Ben Wallace. We have a defence secretary who served in the army, which very few defence ministers, myself included, had the opportunity to do so, and is admirably equipped. And I don't understand some of these arguments that Washington has been using, that he's not a prime minister. We've had 3 British secretary generals. None of them have been prime minister. Lord Ismay, Peter Carrington was foreign secretary, George Robertson was defence secretary, and then the Americans have also said, well, they'd prefer somebody from the EU. Well, Stoltenberg is not from the EU. He's from Norway. So these are not very strong objections. We have a first-class candidate in Ben Wallace, and I hope that in the extra year's extension that Stoltenberg has been given to lead the alliance, I hope that the British government will represent Ben Wallace's case.
What do you think Biden doesn't like about him?
I've really no idea. I mean, when you hear Washington's against something, you don't know whether it's the State Department, the Pentagon, the White House, or where this particular thing has come from. What I do know is you've got an extremely experienced and competent British Defence Secretary. It's a long time since we've had a British head of a NATO. We've got a first-class candidate and somebody who's actually served in the army on the front line.
And von der Leyen's record as defence minister in Germany is mixed, would be the diplomatic way of putting it.
Well, she didn't have the budget that she needed. Germany was then, and still is, behind, was not complying with the 2% that NATO committed to spend. And by the way, at that very summit where we turned down Ukraine's request for help, all 30 members of NATO committed to spend 2% of their GDP on defence by 2024. That's next year. 9 years in, only 7 of the 30 spend 2%. And there are 12 of the 30 members that don't even spend 1.5%. So, NATO members have got to look at each other, I think, and see what more they can be doing to help Ukraine now and to help beef up their own defence.
Domestically, there are calls from, you'll be aware of former colleagues like Tobias Ellwood, who's chair of the Defence Select Committee, who says that the bare minimum is being spent on the UK's armed forces. Do you think that in reality there is going to be any more money to up the defence budget, given the economic circumstances?
Well, if you don't keep your country safe, you can't really do anything else. Everything depends on that. And therefore, I do think, given what's happening now, given the instability in the Middle East, given the pressures, that we see in the Indo-Pacific, given what's happened on our own continent and the fact that international terrorism has not gone away, we're living through a very dangerous time. Now, if you go back to the turn of this century, back to, say, 1999, when we didn't have any of this stuff, long before 9/11 and before Putin and Russian aggression, we were spending 2.7% of our national wealth on defence. I started to increase the budget when I was Defence Secretary, but it certainly needs increasing again.